I was dining with some friends at a restaurant a few days ago. There were 6 of us and we had a great time. We ate a lot, we had plenty to drink and lots of good conversation too. And in total we were there about 2 hours. And all during that time, of course, we were not wearing masks. Occasionally, when the conversation quietened, I found myself wondering, is this safe? What's the chance of us catching COVID during this lovely meal? And of course, the problem is there's no easy way of answering that question, is there? But I did some research after I got home, and I think I've found an interesting way to get at least an approximation for if there is COVID risk or not in any particular place. What I'm suggesting is one of these almost literally little black boxes. It's a CO2 detector. It's inexpensive, and CO2 is an interesting thing to understand as well in terms of how much there is present. And there's a sort of a weak correlation between CO2 levels and possibly COVID levels too. We already have in our house a smoke detector. Maybe we have a carbon monoxide detector too. Why don't we have a CO2 detector also? When it comes to measuring CO2 levels and ignoring COVID for the moment, how much is too much? How much is not enough? Well, the experts, you know about experts, they say it's best to keep the CO2 levels below about 1,000 parts per million. Some people even say it's better to keep it below 600 parts per million. And once you start going over about 1,600 parts per million, there's a growing risk that you might start to get a headache, you might feel a bit sleepy and have trouble concentrating at work. OSHA says that you shouldn't be exposed to an average of more than 5,000 parts per million over an 8-hour period. And to see just how high is way too much, once you go over about 40,000 parts per million, that's a 4% CO2 concentration, compare that to oxygen, which is about 20% in normal air, then that's what is called immediately dangerous. Now, what about zero CO2? Well, there's actually no such thing as zero. The normal level of CO2 in normal air is about 415 parts per million. So let's talk about CO2 meters now. And here's a sample one that I purchased from Amazon. Let me first of all turn it on by pushing the button on the side. And as you see, it took a while to turn on, and now it's taking a while to come up with a reading. And it's saying 658 parts per million. The flashing green light is that it's safe at that sort of level. We also have temperature and humidity readings as well, but they're not very accurate. And if we leave this for a while, you'll probably see that the number will change from what it is to the actual level in this area. These meters tend to be a little bit slow to adjust to changing concentrations. The best of these meters use an NDIR sensor, that stands for non-dispersion of infrared, and they're about plus or minus 10% accurate, so they're far from exact. How do you know how good a meter you have? Take it outside and see what the outside meeting is. They have inside them a rechargeable battery and hopefully a recharging point. Some of them don't have rechargeable batteries. They go through alkaline batteries very quickly, so best to have a rechargeable. And if you're buying one on Amazon, look to spend $50, $100, something in that sort of price range. To see how good they are, take them outside to calibrate them. And you should expect them to come to a level kind of sort of close to 415. This one reads 445 to 465, and most of the time gives a similar sort of reading inside as well. Now you might notice that currently it's reading a bit high. That's because it's directly in front of where I'm speaking much of the time, so the CO2 is coming straight out of my mouth and straight into the sensor, causing it to read a little higher than it normally would. I've tested it in several other places as well. I slept one night with the bedroom door shut, and I was curious to see what happened to the CO2 levels overnight. To my surprise, they didn't go up much at all. I guess that's due to leaks and drafts, and in the morning it was much the same as it was 8 hours before. Had some guests around a few nights ago. There were 4 adults, 2 children, and mustn't forget 2 dogs as well. And after a couple of hours, I was astonished to see the level had gone up to about 1600. Another test that you can do is put it in your car. Now this is getting closer down to 468. It's closer to normal because I'm not breathing in front of it. In the car, if you have the air flowing normally from outside to inside, then levels should stay low. But if you turn it to recycle, or if you turn it off entirely, you'll be surprised how quickly the level will rise in your car. Once I'd done that and had an understanding for what the meter was showing and what was normal and what was not, I then went to a local supermarket and was pleased to see that it was reading about 800, which I thought was acceptable. That's twice normal. Then I went to a second supermarket where it was reading about 1500, and that's 4 times normal. And that's at the point where you're starting to think about headaches, loss of concentration, other things, and that's not quite so good at all. I also discovered that these readings can sometimes suffer from a false positive. I had some hand sanitizer and put some on my hand, very much like that. You all know how this works, don't you? And then I was holding the meter, and let's see if it's going to do it this time. Oh yes, look at that. It soared up to 5,000 very quickly. Apparently, alcohol causes it to get confused, and all the alcohol coming off your hands, you can smell it, can't you, from some distance away, also triggers a high reading on this meter. So beware of false positives. Now let's talk about how the CO2 level matches possibly the COVID level. The thing is that we breathe out CO2 with every breath, and if we're infectious, we do the same with COVID. Every time we breathe out, some COVID virus particles are coming out of our lungs and out of our mouth. So the more we breathe out of carbon dioxide, perhaps the more we're breathing out of COVID as well, and not just what we're breathing out, what the people around us are breathing out as well. Both the CO2 and the COVID particles hang around in the air. They don't fall down. Well, CO2 slowly goes down because it's a bit heavier than normal air, but the aerosolized COVID particles hang about in the air for a long time. Both the CO2 and the COVID particles get blown about by breezes and drafts, and of course when fresh air comes into a room, it pushes out the stale air, it pushes out the CO2, it pushes out the COVID particles, meaning that yes, we do have a reasonable sort of match between how the CO2 behaves and how the COVID behaves. But there are some discontinuities as well. The first assumption is, or the first question is, are people infected or not? Who cares if we're in a room full of people if none of them are infected? We'll get a high CO2 level, but we won't get a high COVID level. So in that case, there would be a disconnect between the 2 levels. The second point is maybe they are wearing masks around you. Now, whatever you think of masks and who likes putting them on, certainly not me, but probably they cut down about 50% of the COVID transmission, but they make no difference to your CO2 levels at all. So there's another variable that might impact on the relationship between CO2 and COVID. The third one is, very, very rarely you might be in a building that has really good HEPA-type filters on their air system, and the filters are not only really good, but they are also fresh and regularly changed. In that case, the filters will be taking out some of the COVID particles, but they will not be taking out any of the CO2. So you have these 3 points of discontinuity, meaning that really all you can say is the more CO2 there is, the more the odds are going against you in terms of maybe there's also a growing amount of COVID. What do you do based on the number you see on here? The higher the number, the greater the possible risk, kinda, sorta. So if you're in a place that's showing a high reading for CO2, maybe there's going to be a matching high reading for COVID. Limit your time there. Don't dally around, don't dawdle, don't browse through the aisles. Quickly buy what you need and get out of there as soon as you can. Say you've noticed that you have 2 different supermarkets, and one typically has a low reading, the other typically has a high reading. Well, you know which one to shop at then, don't you? One more thing to realize, that the numbers that you are getting on your meter will vary from time to time. For example, if the location you're at has all the windows open and plenty of fresh air coming in, then that'll be flushing out the bad air more quickly. The number will be lower than if it's got the heating or the cooling running and all the windows shut. Another factor, self-evidently, is the more people in an area, the more CO2 that's being breathed out and possibly the more COVID particles. But as well as that, remember that the COVID particles hover in the air for an extended period of time before they dry out and drop down. So it's not just how many people can you see now, it's also how many people have been there in the recent past as well, which you can't see. To sum up, it's kind of sort of good to know what the CO2 levels are around you. Just because it's kind of sort of good to know what the CO2 levels are, perhaps there is also some match between the CO2 level and the COVID virus level. The good news is these little meters are cheap and accurate enough for our purposes. They're easy to use, they're easy to understand. And if you'd like to know a lot more than that, please now visit my website article for more discussion and more details. Thank you for watching. I hope this has been helpful.